Okay, can people hear me?
We can hear you, Giles. That's fine to start.
Okay. So welcome to today's Faraday Masterclass, which is about fast software for simulating battery operation. So while you're waiting, please can you introduce yourself into the chat box and select all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments. So the way this is going to work is for the first half an hour, we're going to talk about Faraday software for Newman models. And while we're giving the talk, you can type in questions into the comment box as illustrated on the right-hand side of your screen. And these will be monitored. And then at the end of the talk, we'll try and address those questions in the remaining part of the hour. So a few words about best practice. The first one is, if at all possible, if you can avoid distraction or multitasking, that helps engage with the talk. Secondly, if you can make sure to introduce yourself into the chat box. And then throughout the talk, you can post questions or post comments about the talk. And as I said, we'll get round to those at the end of the talk. And then I don't think you really need to think too hard about the 4 and 5. They're fairly common sense. So the main presenters of the talk are going to be Dr. Robert Timms, who's at Oxford, who's a postdoc on the Faraday multi-scale modelling project, and Dr. Jamie Foster, who's at Portsmouth, who's a lecturer in applied mathematics. So both presenters have got interests in computational modelling. And then the objectives of the talk, I'm going to start off and I'm going to review the standard macroscopic model of battery performance, which is something called the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model, which you've probably heard of as, it's more commonly known as the Newman model. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the parameterization of the model and why parameterizing the model is really important if you want to get a model that's quantitatively correct and that can actually predict experiments. And then move on to just briefly introduce Faraday's Newman model software before handing over to Jamie, who will talk about Dandelion, which is one of the packages, and Robert, who will talk about PyBound, which is the other. So very briefly, why might you worry about macroscale battery models and why are they useful? You can use them to give predictions of battery performance. So for example, that you can think about something like a drive cycle, where you know what the current of the battery, you know what the current draw from the battery is, and you want to predict what the voltage of the battery is given a particular current. Or you can use it to do things like predict state of health or state of charge of a battery. And you can also use these models to guide your experiments or to interpret data from experiments. And the nice thing about the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model is it can be related to the microscale physics. So for example, you can use DFT calculations to parameterize some of the models that go into the macroscopic lithium transport models that you use in the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model. So a brief review of the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model is given. Hang on. need to go back a slide. There we go. Right, so I'm going to start off with this brief review of the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model. So this is a model for a planar cell, as illustrated in this cartoon at the top of the page. And here you see you've got two electrodes, you've got an anode and a cathode separated by a porous spacer. And the electrodes are particulate, so they're composed, these small balls are meant to represent the particles of active material. And then the whole thing is bathed in electrolyte. And so you've got transport occurring both within the electrode particles and within the electrolyte, which runs across the whole cell. So you've got two scales to this model. There's a macro scale dimension, which is the dimension running across the cell, and a microscale dimension, which is the dimension of the individual particles. So, and the macroscale model is obtained by volume averaging some equations for the electrolyte, and then this couples to microscale diffusion equations for lithium transport inside the individual electrode particles. And the physics that goes into the model, there's really four key components to the physics. There's lithium transport in the electrode material, where the lithium is in solid solution, and then you've got lithium and charge transport in the electrolyte. And those two transport mechanisms couple together via a charge transfer reaction that occurs at the interface between the electrode particles and the electrolyte. So in other words, on the surface of the electrode particles. And the final piece of physics is you need to account for charge transport in the electrode matrix, but that's fairly straightforward, that's Ohm's law. Now, what I'd like to emphasize is that in order to get this model working well, you need to parameterize it properly, and you need to spend quite a bit of time thinking about parameterizing the model properly. So if I start first with the electrolyte transport, the model needs to account for the dependence of lithium diffusivity and the electric conductivity of the electrolyte. And so the dependence of that on the lithium concentration in the electrolyte. And so we've taken data for LiPF6, which is one of the very common electrolytes from this paper by Ecker in 2015, and fitted to that data. And so the bottom two graphs show how the diffusivity and the conductivity depend upon lithium concentration. Active material transport is also really important because it's absolutely key to the performance of the battery. And it turns out for most materials, the mobility of the lithium is very, very sensitive upon the concentration within the material. And in fact, for something like graphite, you get a variation in diffusivity of lithium, which is almost 4 orders of magnitude, depending on the concentration. And what that means is that if you try and model transport within the electrode particles via a linear diffusion equation, you get very poor results. And so here we've fitted to data from Ecker for graphite and this variant of NMC. The data is in black, the fit is in red, and that turns out to be an adequate fit in order to get really rather good results. And the final component to data fitting that you need to do in order to get the model working well is for the Butler-Volmer equation. So the Butler-Volmer equation is the equation that tells you what the current is that goes across the edge of the electrode particle into the electrolyte. And that's a function of this thing, the overpotential, which is essentially the potential difference between the electrode and the electrolyte with this equilibrium potential or open circuit voltage subtracted off from that potential difference. So when the overpotential is 0, the current goes to 0. And as you go through 0, the current reverses. And this is the thing you need to get correct here is the open circuit voltage for your particular material. So on the left-hand side, you see an open circuit voltage for graphite, in the middle for NMC, and on the right for LFP. And for graphite and NMC, there's really quite a marked variation in open circuit potential with changes in concentration in lithium in the electrode material. And if you throw all of that together, you can actually get very, very accurate simulations of real experimental data, and that's not just discharge curves. So we've gone and tested this out on drive cycle data, which I think is a relatively severe test of the model, and we've compared to some experimental results that Alana Aragon-Zulka in Lancaster has for a Samsung graphite NCA cell, and also that Ferran Brossa has in Warwick. And they both show very good agreement. So I'm going to show you Alana's results here. In the top figure, you see the current draw that's been taken off the cell as a function of time. So you can see it's very non-uniform current draw. And then in the bottom figure, bottom two figures, there's a comparison between the voltage of the cell that's measured experimentally and the voltage predicted by the model. So the voltage predicted by the model is in orange and the experimental voltage is in black. And you see that there's amazingly good agreement between the two. So I want to say a little bit about the motivation of why we spent so much time writing these codes. And the reason really is that the commercial codes that are available are quite slow. And that's fine when you're considering a single cell. But in reality, you might very well like to consider something like a pouch cell or a jelly roll cell, which are quite large. So for example, a pouch cell is composed of 50 single cells, around 50 single cells stacked upon each other. And it might have a size comparable to something like a pack of coffee. And because it's so large, it can heat up significantly, and the different parts of the cell get to really quite different temperatures. And that wouldn't be a problem, except that the electrochemistry of a cell is very temperature dependent. And in particular, the hotter the cell gets, the easier it is for it to discharge, and therefore the hotter it gets. And so you get this sort of runaway, you can get this runaway process of heating in particular parts of your pouch cell. So in order to properly model a pouch cell, you have to account for the non-uniform temperature throughout the three-dimensional pouch cell. And you then have to couple that to the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model, but you need to solve the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model at every space point within the pouch cell. And since the Newman model is two-dimensional, the problem for the entire pouch cell is five-dimensional. And it's well known that such high-dimensional problems are extremely challenging. And in order to solve them and get accurate solutions, you need really very fast and efficient code. As far as Faraday software for the DFM model is concerned, there are two packages we're going to talk about. The first of these is called Dandelion, and that's an ultra-fast, accurate code. And it's very powerful, which means it can tackle very large systems. It's easy to use, so there's no coding experience required, and it has a library of chemistries which we hope to enlarge as the project goes on. And it has this 3D thermal electrochemical capability for pouch cells, and we hope to extend that to jelly roll cells in the near future. In contrast, PyBAM has a slightly different focus. It's still very fast code, but it's designed to be extensible. And the idea behind PyBAM is really that is for prototyping new models. So for example, if you wanted to look at something like lithium plating, you might want to modify the Newman model a bit to incorporate lithium plating into the Newman model. And you can do that fairly straightforwardly through PyBAM. And similar to Dandelion, it has a library of chemistries, and it also has some other features. For example, it includes accurate single particle approximations, which can be used to enhance the speed of your calculation for given cells and for given discharge rates. And then a very brief review of the advantages over commercial packages, and these really come down to the speed and the power of these PyBAM and Dandelion. They're much faster, and speed is important not just for these thermal electrochemical problems, but also for things like optimization and parameter estimation, where you have to make a large number of computations in order to arrive to your answer. And I'm going to hand over to Jamie now, who'll take over the presentation.
Okay, so hello everybody, and well, the first thing to say is thanks for responding to the poll that we put up earlier. So there's 130 something of you here, and it looks like a majority of you are interested in these kinds of models for supplementing experiments that you're doing. So that's super helpful information for us to know, and well, hopefully that will play into future developments for us. Could I have the next slide, Giles? Okay, good. So I'm going to go into a bit more depth on Dandelion. And I guess the first thing to say is what you need to do to install the program. So we'll take you through kind of in-depth instructions on how to do that in the workshops that we've got coming up in the subsequent weeks. But the thing I want to highlight here is that it's very easy to do independent of the platform you're on. So if you're a Windows user, a Mac user, or a Linux user, the installation is straightforward. And even if you want to install this on a high performance computing type hardware, you can go and do that as well. So once you've done the install, Dandelion comes with a few kind of default simulations just for you to test that your installation is working properly. And one of the default simulations is just a simple discharge curve of a graphite NMC cell. So you'll see the output of one of the default simulations in the bottom left corner of the slide. And while the simulation is running, which by the way for this particular example takes about a second on a kind of typical laptop computer, and that's at the kind of fidelity that you can expect, 3 or 4 digits of accuracy in your solution. So they're well-resolved solutions. The running of the simulation will be accompanied by a kind of live plot of what's happening inside your virtual cell. So if you look in the top right of the slide, you'll see the live output that accompanies a simulation that I'm talking about. And you can see you get live updates of concentration profiles and potential profiles throughout the cell. And output from the simulation, so things like these concentration and potential profiles, cell voltages, are saved to text files so that you can, after the simulation's finished, you can read the data into MATLAB or ParaView or whatever it is you like to use to make your plots and get your pictures ready for papers that you might be writing. And I should just say that the output can be customized. So if you're interested in a particular feature of what's going on inside the cell, you can tell Dandelion about that and it will save that data for you as well. Okay, so once you've run a default simulation, perhaps the next thing you might like to do is tweak some parameters of your cell. So maybe you want to change the C rate, or you want to make one electrode thicker, for example. The way that you would do that would be to open up the parameters file. You can see a screenshot of that in the bottom right of the slide. And there are various lines in there. You just change the number next to the property that you'd like to alter, save the text file, and press go again, and you will simulate this new cell that you've parameterized. Next slide, please. Okay, so a couple more words about the parameterizations that are available in Dandelion. One thing we've done is to make sure that you've got some parameterizations for commercial cells kind of built in to the software. So working with the people listed under the bullet points there, we've got parameterizations for COCAM cells, a Samsung cell, and an LG cell. And we also have what we call a chemical library. So we've kind of scraped the literature for properties for things like graphite, NCA, NMC, and LFP. And so with relative ease, you can go and swap in different electrode chemistries as you wish, so that you can go and compare them to your experiments. And a little note here, so if you have other parameterizations that you'd like to be available in Dandelion, please tell us about it. And hopefully we can work together to build those in as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a result that Giles has already showed, so I shan't reiterate how good the agreement is here. What I do want to point out is the kind of computational resource that's required to do a simulation like this. So in the orange box on the right, you'll see kind of indicator of that. So this takes less than a minute on a standard desktop machine. So this is a kind of machine that I imagine everyone has available. And to put into context just how quick that is, the kind of window of real time that's being simulated here is about 7.5 hours. And the computational time, as I say, is less than a minute. So we're really running these simulations at orders of magnitude faster than happens in reality. And that opens up the possibility for using these software tools for control purposes and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other kind of major selling point for Dandelion is that it can do these very large systems. And I don't want to go too in depth on this, but typically in computing, as you increase the size of a system, the computational cost gets very large very, very quickly. And in Dandelion, we've worked hard to make sure that it exhibits something called linear scaling. And what this means is that you can, as you increase the numbers of equations that you're trying to solve, your computational cost does go up, but only in proportion to the number of equations you have. So it remains manageable for longer. And to give you some idea of what we can do, we can solve tens of millions of equations in less than half an hour, again on computing resources that everyone has available to them. And you may well ask, well, why should I care about that? Why is that important? And if we flip to the next slide, I've got an example of why that's important. So here is a meshing of a COCAM pouch cell. So there are 48 cells stacked within the pouch. And each of those 48 cells has been discretized in a 12 by 36 grid. And if you write down a fully fledged electrochemical model on this geometry, roughly what you're asking to do is solve 5 million equations. So this really is a lot of computational expense. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a video of a result of a simulation like this. So this cell's being discharged at 1C. We're solving, as I said, the fully fledged electrochemical model and predicting the temperature within the cell. And we've done boundary conditions here where the cell is thermally isolated, except for at the tabs. So if you look on the left-hand edge of the simulation, you can see the evidence of some cooling going on via tabs there. And even though this simulation is very heavy lifting computationally, we can still run simulations, even of this complexity, faster than reality. So this is a 1C discharge, so you're seeing a real-time window of about an hour, and you can do simulations like this on a laptop in about half an hour. Okay, so that's all I've got to say about Dandelion for now. There'll be another poll question coming up momentarily, So we'll give you a bit of time to respond to that, and then we'll hand over to Robert. Thanks.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'll just start out by just finishing up that poll, and then I can relay the results to you as they come in. They've come in now, so I'll do that before I get started then. So it looks like most people currently who are here neither use nor develop models, but of those who do, most people seem to use models rather than develop new models. So we seem to have more users here rather than developers. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to take a few minutes now to talk about PyBAM, this other package that we've been developing, and try and talk about what our idea was with PyBAM and what the sort of focus of this package is compared with Dandelion. And then I'll show you some examples of things you can do in PyBAM before we finish off. So really, we wanted to make something that was a framework that allowed people to easily build, solve, and share battery models as well. And the idea of this was that it would be fast, flexible, and modular. So it's very easy to chop and change things. So as Giles said earlier at the start, it's a good tool for prototyping new models because you can quickly swap out one piece of physics for another. So if you want to change the description of what's happening in the particles for the transport in there, you can change that very easily. And really the idea is that it's trying to encourage collaboration across the whole battery community, particularly within Faraday. So there's lots of great work happening across lots of different work packages in Faraday, people thinking about degradation, people doing experiments, people doing reduced order models, and I always try and bring lots of that together so that everyone can benefit from all of the good research that's going on. So in terms of what's in PyBAM, it's got lots of the standard models like the newer model that we saw earlier in the standard sort of 1D geometry, and you can do pouch cells as well. But these are all based around this modular framework, so they're easy to chop and change. And then like Dandelion, we've got a library of different chemistries and different types of cells. All of these models can be fully coupled with thermal models, so you can include temperature effects in any of these models. And something else we've worked quite hard on is to implement an experimental suite within PyBAM, so it's really easy for people to supplement their experiments with a bit of modeling. So if we go to the next slide, please. So before I show you some examples of things you can do with PyBAM, I just want to mention you can go to our website, pybam.org, and there's lots of examples and documentation there. But something that makes the software quite easy to use and develop in is that we've got a very active and open community of people currently working on PyBAM or using PyBAM in their research. This diagram here just shows the current contributors to PyBAM. So these are people who are contributing code to PyBAM and putting models into PyBAM, and we've got more people using it as well. But we've got a very active community, so it's easy to get help with anything you want to do. And if you want to get involved with that, you can get on GitHub. We've got a Slack channel. You can email me if you want to be added to that, and my details will be at the end. And it's also easy to install, much like Dandelion. It's cross-platform. It's available on the PyPy package listing, so you can just pip install it like any other Python package. Yeah, next slide, please. So we tried to make this interface for using PyBAM as straightforward as possible, so that if you just want to run something out of the box, a pre-existing model like the Dor-Fuller-Newman model, it's really simple to do so. So here you import the package, you tell it you want to load up the Dor-Fuller-Newman model, you throw that model into your simulation, you hit solve, you hit plot, and you get a standard set of plots out at the end. And this is fully customizable, so you can choose which variables you want to plot and so on. And if you run this on a computer, this will be a slider plot, so you can drag backwards and forwards in the time you simulate it over. But all of these things that you see here are fully customizable. So with the model, you can change, you might want to include thermal effects or not in this particular model. You might want to change the parameters you're using. In terms of the simulation, you might want to change tolerances for the solver. You might want to change and do something a bit more interesting in the constant current discharge. So we've got some examples in the following slides that just show you some of the things you can change. Okay, next slide, please. So one thing we try to do is to make it really easy to supplement your experiments with some modeling. So we've got this experiment class that lets you write out any experimental protocol in sort of plain English. So there's some keywords that let you do certain things, but you can basically specify any power, current, or voltage control just using text strings, and then you can pass that experiment into your simulation, and then it will go away and run that experiment for you. So hopefully this makes it very easy for people who perhaps aren't familiar with modeling or coding to just go away and do some simulations of their experiment. And again, you can combine this with different models, with different pieces of physics, so you can try and figure out what's going on in your experiment. And as we mentioned at the start of this talk, in Giles' introduction, you can use it to sort of prototype experiments you might want to run. Yeah, next slide, please. So some of the other things you can change in these simulations, as I said, you can choose different parameter sets, and it's easy to pick these. You can either select them by referencing a particular paper. So here's a parameter set for an LGM 50 cell from the paper Chen 2020 is the reference. So that just collects all of the parameters from one paper and lets you use those in your simulation. But if you want more control over that, you can choose parameters by component, so by anode, cathode, etc. And even more so, it's very easy to tweak an existing parameter set if you just want to change a few values or include your own parameters. So these are just housed as CSV files that you can add your own parameters to. We can simulate drive cycles, so you can provide some current as data. So you can just, again, give a CSV file with current as a function of time, for example, and throw that into simulation. It'll go away and do that for you. And as we saw already, it's easy to simulate experimental protocols. So you might do some standard things like GITT, for example. Yeah, next slide, please. Something else it's very easy to do in PyBAM is compare different models. So because we've tried to make this framework as modular and flexible as possible, it means it's very easy to prototype different models, to include different physical effects. And when you do that, you might want to compare these two models that include one piece of physics or not. Or if you're in someone who's interested in developing reduced order models, you might want to see how does your reduced order model compare to the full model, for example. And in PyBAM, it's very easy to do. You can just create a list of all the models you want to compare, and then loop over that list to solve them all. And you can throw all of that solutions at our plotting interface and automatically generate plots that compare all of the different models that you've included. And again, yeah, to give a typical idea of sort of simulation times, this has solved the Doyle-Fuller-New model and a slightly simpler model called the single particle model. And in total, this took about just over half a second to simulate both of those. Next slide, please. So something else I wanted to make it easy to do is to interface with other software, just to extend the applicability or the usability of PyBAM. So our primary focus has been on sort of one-dimensional models, although you can do pouch cell models in PyBAM as well at the moment. But if you want to do some modeling in a different geometry, say a jelly roll, or if you're interested in some pack level simulations, you might want to combine PyBAM with a different modeling framework, so just like an equivalent circuit model. So in this example, we've got an equivalent circuit model for charge and thermal transport on the jelly roll scale, and this is coupled to PyBAM, which models the electrochemistry on the local scale. So it's very easy to sort of combine PyBAM with other softwares to really extend it to different scenarios, which might be particularly interesting for people who are wanting to do pack level simulations, but with some electrochemical physics-based modeling combined with that. I think that's all the examples I've got here, really. Just want to give you a flavour of what's going on, but as Jamie said, we've got tech sessions coming up in the coming weeks for both Dandelion and PyBAM. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to our website and come along to those tech sessions to see what we can do. But I think I'll stop there so that we've got plenty of time for questions. I don't know, Giles, are you doing the ending bit, or someone else maybe, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, I mean, this is just the information for where you find out more about these packages. So you can contact, you can look at the PyBAM website or email Robert. And if you want to download Dandelion, then you can get access to our GitHub page by emailing Jacqueline Edge. And for technical queries, the best person to ask is Ivan Korotkin, who's responsible for most of the coding of Dandelion, and yeah, so he's really the best person to ask. And so this is the next week's Faraday Masterclass, and I'm going to hand you over to Fran for the questions now. So I think we'll all try and answer the questions.
Giles, I'm very happy for you to pose the questions. There's one here to get you started though. Very interesting talk, Seifel says, around slides 11 and 12. I think you mentioned transport and electroparticles. Do you consider interference or grain boundary effects, and can you extract their influence across the electrode? Thanks, Seifel.
So what we do there is we're using a crude model, this nonlinear diffusion model, that implicitly takes account of the grain boundary effects because it's quantified against experiment. So presumably, if you make a graphite electrode particle, it depends on how you make it as to what the coefficients in the nonlinear diffusion equation should be. So I don't think all graphite particles will be the same, and similarly, I doubt that all NMC particles will be the same. So at the moment, we haven't gone into the details of how grain boundaries or how the number of grain boundaries, density of grain boundaries affects the nonlinear diffusion. Hope that's answered the question. Okay, are there more questions then, Fran?
If you click the Q&A box at the bottom, Giles, you can see the questions that have been asked. So there's one. There's one from Aaron Walsh. Kind of answered it in the chat, but so Aaron was asking about whether we can use these things to interface with machine learning. So just to vocalize the answer, I guess, I'm paraphrasing my answer that I gave, but something along the lines of that. I don't see any reason why either of these software tools couldn't be used as a kind of a pseudo experiment, if I could put it that way. So you can use the softwares to generate, data sets in inverted commas that you could then feed to your machine learning algorithm, train it off that. So presumably there's potential there because you can, because the simulations are so quick to do, you can generate bigger data sets than you could with real experimental apparatus. Do
you want to give me another question?
I can give you another question. So this is from James Lahoo, who asks, we mentioned that each of the softwares have material databases for parameters. So first part, are they the same in both softwares? And what do you see as next steps for parameterizations for expanding the databases?
So I don't think that they are the same for both softwares. I think we've done them independently, but they're probably pretty similar.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Some of the sets are shared, I think. So we've got things like the Ecker set and the set from
Right.
and LGM50. So I think there's some overlap, but maybe we should coordinate on that to make sure that everyone's got the best sets of parameters for both softwares.
And personally, I think the more data sets we have that we can incorporate into the library, the better, because the more data sets you have, the more useful the package becomes. I mean, as long as you're fairly happy about the quality of those data sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to answer the next steps thing, I mean, one thing we can obviously do is keep our eye on the literature and kind of, plug in more parameters as they become available. But with the kind of wealth of experiments that are being done within Faraday, it would be great if, people in our consortium could, feed us data that they want available for models, and we can, make those available for you kind of ahead of the game, so to speak. Should I have another question, or is there anything else you want to say about that? Okay, so the next question, this is from Stephen Parry, who says, are the simulation codes unique, or are there other codes available? And a following question, if there are other codes, have the results been compared? Also useful to know how far the codes have been benchmarked to real experimental results.
As to whether I mean, there are other codes that solve the Doyle-Fuller-Newman model. So there are commercial codes such as COMSOL. There's one that Dassault has called Dimler. And I'm sure that there are other commercial codes available, but they're all much slower. We have benchmarked against various experiments. So for Dandelion, this is so against that experiment you saw from Alana, and also against experiments you've seen from Ferran, and I think Even has done some other stuff as well. I know that PyBAM has been benchmarked against COMSOL, and we've benchmarked against Dimler in terms of other computing packages. Do you have anything to add to that, Robert?
I guess we've also compared with Dandelion, so that PyBAM and Dandelion give the same results. So I guess by proxy,
yeah,
they will compare. Yeah, we also compared to Fran's data set directly.
Yeah,
I think it would be fair to say that we've done our due diligence in comparing. I think we're confident that they're genuinely solving the equations we claim they're solving properly. I think that's...
Yeah, I think hopefully we can collaborate more in the future with more people as a result of this, so that people are using it more, and then more people use it, the more validation we get, I guess. So,
right, yeah.
Ongoing.
Okay, next question. Anything else you want to add to that? Or? No? Okay, so this is one from Nivedita. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. So question is, can we model lithium sulfur?
and yeah, I don't know the answer to that. As far as, I mean, Robert, do you know anything about lithium sulfur? Have you tried to do that?
We've got some people who are interested in doing lithium sulfur, and I think have started to think about it. So if you're interested in doing it, maybe email me and I can put you in touch with them. Would be my answer.
Good. All right. Okay, so one from John Owen. Do we calculate electrode tortuosity using the Brueggemann approximation as Newman did, or do we do something cleverer, or we don't care because it doesn't make any difference?
So we currently use Brueggemann, but the tortuosity is in there as a submodel, so it's, you know, you can extend it to include different effects. We're talking to people about, you know, people are doing simulations at a different length scale to us to try and give us those effective properties. Does it make any difference? I don't know if I can answer that question right now. Maybe not. Maybe. But in short, it would be, we currently use Brueggemann, but yeah, we're thinking about using other things to calculate those effective properties. But at the end of the day, I think when you get to the macro scale equations, you just want a number.
Yeah. I mean, to answer that question slightly differently, I mean, so users are free to specify what they like for permeability. So if a user has a preference on this, like if somebody particularly wants to use Brueggemann or somebody particularly doesn't want to use Brueggemann, they're free to do that. So, yeah.
I mean, another way of putting it is, if you have image data, it's actually relatively straightforward to calculate the permeability that you should stick into the equations. I know that James LaHoo, for example, has got loads and loads of image data from UCL and has been doing exactly this calculation. So if you have a particular battery in mind and somebody's gone and constructed a three-dimensional image of what the electrode looks like, then you can use that three-dimensional image. And I think James has got some package that does this, and I can't remember what it's called. Is it PoreSpy, Jamie?
There is a package called PoreSpy that does something like that.
Yeah, so
I'm not sure if that's James's, but
is it Open Impala, I think, or
yeah, so you don't need The point is that it's not actually incorporated into either of these packages, but what you would do if you wanted to do that is you would go and use one of these other packages, so like PoreSpy or OpenImpala, in order to compute the number that you stick into Dandelion or the number that you stick into PyBAM for the permeability.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So there's more questions here. I'm going to be selfish and ask a question from me to the audience and ask them to put the answer in the chat, if I may. So I'll just ask the question, which is that, so from the first poll, it seems like most people are wanting to use these softwares to compare to experiment. So maybe something useful that you could tell us in the chat or in the Q&A would be what experiments in particular you want to butt these bits of software against. So if there are any thoughts about that, I'll be really interested to hear them. Another question from the audience. So this is from Chuan Cheng, who asks, when using Dandelion or PyBAM to simulate a single cell, would you calculate the overpotential distribution, reaction rate distribution, and lithium ion concentration distribution through the thickness of the electrodes, i.e. in 1D, or through the 2D plane of the electrode?
You can. So I presume you're talking about you'd calculate it in 1D because it would be the same at every point in the 2D plane of the electrode until you get towards the ends. I presume that's what.
Yeah. So I think maybe the answer is that so you have a choice about that. So maybe could you pull up the slide with the COCAM meshing on it, Giles? Maybe that would be a useful thing to show.
This one here.
Yeah. So I think this maybe helps articulate the answer to this, which is that, so each one of those kind of little grey slabs is a solve of the Newman model. And so if you wanted the 2D distribution in the electrode, you basically look at that kind of tiling there. So you can have a series of 1D simulations which mesh a two-dimensional plane, and you can couple those simulations together either thermally or by the potential in the current collectors, for example. I think that. Do you want to add anything to that? Anybody? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is the quantities you get are spatially resolved, and the answer to that is yes, if that's the correct way of reading that question.
Yeah, I think that's. I hope we answered your question. Okay, so next question from Folvos. He asks, very good to have such software at our disposal from an experimentalist. Is the software readily suited to simulate galvanostatic discharge of lithium sulfur cathodes? So I guess maybe we've kind of answered that already. So galvanostatic
discharge, but not necessarily of lithium sulfur.
Yeah.
So I think I presume it would be relatively straightforward to adapt to do lithium sulfur, but we'd need to know what the model is for lithium sulfur.
Yeah.
In order to do that.
And yeah, I think I'd add we've got some people thinking about lithium sulfur, but if people are interested in adding new bits of physics or different chemistries or so on, then they're free to come and collaborate and try and stick that in if there is something you want it to do that it doesn't currently do.
Cool. Okay, next one is from Damika. He says, given the speed, are you working on parameter estimation code? Ideally, if we can provide a drive cycle data set and then get Dandelion to fit a subset of parameters, that would be great. So
currently we're not, but we'd be very happy to collaborate on this. I know that people are doing this with PyBAM. I know in particular that Dave Howie in Oxford is doing parameter estimation with PyBAM. Robert, can you fill in any details on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking pretty hard about parameter estimation at the minute. That's more the route we're going down rather than doing the sort of big scale problems like the pouch cell stuff that you've seen. We've sort of taken the parameter estimation fork in the road. So a lot of our attention is focused there at the minute. So, yeah, get in touch.
Okay, good. So the next one is from Chris Skylaris. He says, thank you for the interesting talk. Does your Newman model include, or can it be made to include, non-uniformity of the electrolyte particles, or at least a range of radii of spherical particles? I assume they're currently described by spheres of the same radius.
So at the moment, we can allow for non-uniformity of spherical radius in space. So you can have big particles, say near the current collector, small particles near the separator. And I think it's something that we're thinking about doing is putting in a bimodal distribution, so you can have big and small particles at the same point in space, but we haven't yet done that.
Yeah, similarly, yeah, we can do graded electrodes at the moment, and are also, yeah, thinking about particle distributions locally.
Okay, good. So something from James Lahoo, who has just shouted "Open Impala" with an exclamation mark. So I'm guessing that's the name of his software for computing tortuosities. So we have a question here from Savan. He says, very interesting. Short question. Can models be tuned to study other battery chemistries? Thinking of Na-ion. So I guess that's the same answer for we've already given, right? So yes.
I think the main thing is knowing what the model is. So knowing what the equations are for your particular battery chemistry, and seeing how easy it is to adapt the existing code to this new set of equations. My feeling is that generally it's not too hard to adapt the Newman model to a different chemistry. I know that that the Oxford lot, the PyBAM lot have looked at lead acid batteries.
Yeah, and I think with PyBAM, it's more of a framework for solving these models rather than a specific implementation of any one model. So we've got people using PyBAM for fuel cells as well. And in terms of equations, it's all symbolic. So you can enter your equations in symbolic form to get that going. So I think we've sort of thought about how to extend PyBAM to things that aren't lithium ion, definitely.
Okay, good. So next question is from Ross, who says, have there been any checks on whether the solutions of the DFN model make sense against experimental data? I mean, not in terms of a current voltage response, but the accuracy of the other states, potentials, concentrations, internal currents, etc., as these are useful for control.
I think it's quite hard to find measurements of the internal states of the cell. I mean, I'd be very interested to see what you had on it. So if you could.
So maybe I can answer a little bit. So one thing I've seen like this is people using MRI measurements to map concentrations inside insertion material in operando. And we have compared against that. So we have done a comparison for a graphite anode using a DFN model. There's a paper on that. So the list of authors is quite long, but Sergei Krachkovsky is the lead author, and it's in Journal of Physical Chemistry C. It's called something like Operando Mapping of Graphite Electrodes. I'm an author on it as well. So I think that's, as far as I know, that's the closest we've come to doing that. Have you got anything else to add to that, Robert? Or?
No, I don't think so in terms of that, no.
Okay.
I would be interested to hear what data people have about the internal states of the cell as it's discharged and charged.
Right.
And if you could, sorry, I didn't catch a name. If whoever asked that question could get back in contact if they have details about experiments that measure the internal states of the cell, I think that would be really, really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so next question, or penultimate question, it looks like, is from Sam. It says, thanks all for an interesting talk. Jamie, you said that you have been combining the literature to add additional materials to the package to consider a new electrode material. But what chemical information is needed to get an accurate result in these simple 2D models? So I suppose an overpotential, the transport properties, by which I mean diffusivities and conductivities. You going to say something, Giles? Or
yeah, so the diffusivities in the active material are usually measured using GITT. So that's where most of that data comes from. So if we go back to so there's, for example, here the data that comes from ECHA, there's GITT data and EIS data.
I mean, anecdotes. So I guess the kind of glib answer to this question is you need all the parameters to get an accurate simulation. But in my experience, and I think people have done careful studies on this and shown it, is that, you know, some parameters have a much more important influence than other ones. So anecdotally, I think the overpotential makes a huge difference to how good the model is. If you get that wrong, then the model predictions won't be very good. And similarly for the diffusivity inside the electrode particle, if you get that wrong, the models won't be very good.
And that's probably the hardest thing to measure,
yeah,
is the diffusivity inside the electrode particles.
So I suppose, yeah, I'm not sure if this isn't a firm answer, but I guess if you get those things right, then you'll probably do all right. And the more parameters you can provide, the better, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Did you? Sorry, Rob. Did you?
No, I think that's
okay.
good.
Right.
Yeah.
So from Billy Wu, very nice. When simulating degradation processes, the magnitude of the residual error in the reaction current density could affect the eventual lifetime. What is the magnitude of the residual versus the side reaction current for a simulation which runs with a practical mesh size?
So I'm not quite sure what this is. This question, do you think, is this question related to conservation of lithium within the scheme? Is that?
Yes, says Billy.
Yeah, so we've been very, very careful to write down a conservative scheme for lithium. So there's no, in the absence of side reactions, there's no lithium gained or lost by the model, by the code. And that, I mean, that was something when we first started writing code for this, it was pretty apparent that if you discretized in the wrong way, you end up slowly losing lithium over time. So you get this numerical degradation of the battery, if you like, which is completely unphysical. So we spent a lot of time getting thinking about what the right elements were in order to avoid that. Mm-hmm. So we're pretty happy about that in our code. And so you can run the battery thousands of times in the absence of any degradation mechanism, and you've got the same amount of lithium there.
Okay, so one more question's popped up in the meantime. So this one is from Michael Cornish, who says, on slide 13, he thinks, is the comparison to the experiment to the same experimental data shown, or was the model fit to a different experiment and then simulated to compare to this separate experiment?
No, I think the comparison to the experiment was, so the fitting was from, so I'd have to ask Ivan about this, but I think the fitting is from GITT data. And then this is a simulation based on that fitting.
Yeah, that fits with my memory as well. I think that's correct.
But I mean, Ivan really has the details about this, and well, Ivan and Alana are currently writing this up. So they're really the people to ask about the exact details.
Okay, good. So I think bang on 3 o'clock, that's the last question answered.
Okay. Well, shall we wrap up then?
Yeah, I'll let you do that. Sorry, I've hijacked your hosting position. I'll shut up now.
No, that was good. So, I mean, I'm just going to go back to the next step slide, just so that you have the relevant websites and email addresses in case you want to get more involved with the software. And then please do come to the training sessions if you're interested. And the training sessions are over the next, Jeremy, do you remember when the training sessions are? Next, I think they're the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Can Jacqueline answer that? I see Jacqueline's here.
She's not there. All the dates and links for registration for the sessions will go out in an email tomorrow along with the recording. But if people would like to look sooner, if they go to Communify, they're also listed there.
Okay, brilliant.
I've got them here if you want me to say. Dandelion is 12th and 19th of May, and PyBAM is 2nd and 9th of June.
Okay, great.
I think the info's on the next slide, Giles. If you flick to the next slide, to that, yeah, Communify, people can sign up there.
And then next week, it's Saiful Islam who's going to talk about atomic scale models. Okay, so I think that's everything that we've got to say. So goodbye, and thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.